Hello, my name is Father Michael Gately. I'm a priest in the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception, and you're watching part 7 of Divine Mercy and the second greatest story ever told. Okay, so in part 6, we learned about the story of Fatima. Now here in part 7, we're going to see how that amazing story ties in with the second greatest story ever told. On May 13, 1981, exactly 64 years after the first apparition of Mary to 3 shepherd children, a small open-air Jeep rode into St. Peter's Square. In it was Pope John Paul II, who warmly greeted the pilgrims who had gathered in the square. Suddenly, a man in the crowd raised a pistol and fired 4 shots at the Pope. One hit his right hand and another his arm. The other 2 struck him in his abdomen, ricocheting inside of him, shredding intestines and piercing his colon, which caused massive internal bleeding. And while the doctors acted quickly, it wasn't enough. The loss of blood was too great. So at 5:45 p.m., after several attempts to revive him, Pope John Paul II, the great Pope of Mercy, was pronounced dead. The third secret of Our Lady of Fatima had come true. Of course, thankfully the Pope did not die that day. But why not? After all, the third secret of Our Lady of Fatima had basically said that the Pope would be shot and killed. So why did he survive? Well, commenting on the third secret, Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, he shed some light on the situation. He said, "The future is not in fact unchangeably set, and the image which the Fatima children saw is in no way a film preview of a future in which nothing can be changed. Indeed, the whole point of the vision is to bring freedom onto the scene and to steer freedom in a positive direction. The purpose of the vision is not to show a film of an irrevocably fixed future. Its meaning is exactly the opposite. It is meant to mobilize the forces of change in the right direction." So put differently, paying attention to the Fatima message is not like going to a psychic or a palm reader. And by the way, please stay away from them. Anyway, such people make it seem as if what they say will absolutely happen. But that denies us the power of human freedom, which is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us in creating us. And with that gift of freedom, we can turn to God in prayer. And by His grace, we can move mountains and even change the course of history. So yes, in the Fatima vision of 1917, the Pope was shot and killed. But it didn't turn out that way in reality. The Pope's life was spared that May 13, 1981, and he did not die that day, though from all accounts he should have. It seemed then that something had happened to alter the otherwise lethal attack. All right, so what happened? Well, it has to do with the power of prayer. You see, when people pray to God with a living faith, it has power. Again, it can change the course of history, and it did change history. John Paul's life was spared at a time he should have died. And I believe that gift of grace came from all the rosaries, penances, and First Saturday devotions inspired by Our Lady of Fatima. And with that grace, Our Lady took action. And that seems to be John Paul II's opinion too. In fact, regarding the shooting, he's quoted as saying, "One hand fired and another guided the bullet." And more specifically, he believed that the guiding hand that spared his life was that of Our Lady of Fatima. Now at the time, John Paul hadn't yet made the connection with Our Lady of Fatima. But later, while in the hospital recovering from the shooting, he reflected on the date, May 13th. Suddenly he remembered it was the anniversary of the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. So with that in mind, he asked that the document containing the third secret, which he had never read, be brought to him. Well, his personal secretary records the Pope's reaction after he read the document.
When he was finished, all his remaining doubts were gone. In Sister Lucia's vision, he recognized his own destiny. He became convinced that his life had been saved. No, given back to him anew, thanks to Our Lady's intervention and protection. It's true, of course, that the bishop dressed in white is killed in Sister Lucia's vision, whereas John Paul II escaped an almost certain death. So, couldn't that have been the real point of the vision? Couldn't it have been trying to tell us that the paths of history, of human existence, are not necessarily fixed in advance, and that there is a providence, a motherly hand, which can intervene and cause a shooter who is certain of hitting his target to miss? One hand shot and another guided the bullet, was how the Holy Father put it.
Now, the Pope's conviction that his life had been given back to him by Our Lady of Fatima only deepened when he later met with and forgave the man who shot him. On that occasion, his would-be assassin spoke words that had a profound effect on the Pope. He said to the Holy Father, "I know I was aiming right. I know that that bullet was a killer. So why aren't you dead?" Well, according to Cardinal Jewish, John Paul carried those words around with him for years, pondering them over and over again. Of course, such pondering nourished John Paul's feeling of gratitude to Our Lady. I mean, it was crystal clear to him that she had spared his life. Okay, but why did she do it? Again, as I mentioned earlier, part of the reason surely had to do with all the prayers and sacrifices of those who had been inspired by the message of Our Lady of Fatima. Also, I'm sure that the fact that the Pope had consecrated his life to Our Lady from the time he was 18 years old, I'm sure that had something to do with it too. But I also believe there was a deeper reason as to why his life was spared. It's divine mercy. And more specifically, it's what I call the deep secret of divine mercy. Now, to appreciate this secret, we need to go back to the beginning. Specifically, we need to go back to the story of Adam and Eve's sin and the seemingly hopeless situation that it caused. Now, recall that situation. By their sin, Adam and Eve rejected God and fell into the clutches of Satan. And if Adam and Eve didn't fully grasp what their sin would mean, Satan sure did. Specifically, he knew that those who sin must die, and that the wage of sin is death. And he also knew that because of that first sin, all of humanity now belonged to him. In other words, he, the first in disobedience, now had rights over the disobedient. In short, Satan knew the truth and demands of divine justice. But there was something that Satan didn't know, something he didn't realize. There's a deeper truth than divine justice, the truth of divine mercy. You see, Satan didn't realize that Adam and Eve had a way out. He didn't realize that they could be saved. And he certainly didn't expect that God would do what he did. And what did God do? Well, in a certain sense, you might say he tricked Satan. How? Well, he, the Lord of life, made himself vulnerable to Satan, the prince of death. And Satan took the bait. Blinded by his hatred and fury, the devil killed the Lord of life. But then, to both Satan's horror and surprise, that unleashed the spring of eternal life for fallen humanity. Specifically, divine mercy gushed forth from Christ's pure side, engulfing the whole world. And that blood and water flowing from Christ's side frees us from Satan's clutches, saves us from sin and death, and brings us into God's own divine life. In summary, then, we could say that the devil knew the deep truth of divine justice, but his inordinate pride did not allow him to understand the deeper truth of divine mercy, the truth that God can bring good, in fact, that he can bring an even greater good out of human evil. Now, it's important that we know this truth that Satan didn't, this secret of divine mercy. All right, so let's look more closely at the secret of divine mercy. And let's begin by asking, what is it specifically? Well, it's the power of God's love to bring not only good out of evil, but an even greater good out of evil. And that's why Satan hates it so much. It not only cancels out his gains, but it reverses them, making them into losses. And so the secret of divine mercy really is the wonder of wonders of divine mercy. It's the truth that leads the church to cry out regarding Adam and Eve's fall, "O happy fault that brought us so great a Redeemer." It's the truth that should prevent us from ever despairing, because no matter how dark our sins, God can still bring not just good, but an even greater good if we turn away from sin and place our trust in Him. Really though, can God truly bring about an even greater good from humanity's evil? Now I'm going to let one of the greatest theologians in the church answer that one. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, the graces of salvation that we receive through Christ's death on the cross are even greater than the salvation that would have come to us had there been no fall and no cross. Now let's see how this secret of divine mercy fits with Fatima and Pope John Paul II. As I mentioned earlier, in a certain sense, Fatima seemed like a failure. I mean, as World War I raged, Our Lady had said that the war would end, but warned of a worse war to come and sufferings of the church by Russia if people didn't do as the Lord had asked. Well, what the Lord had asked for was not fully done, and those terrible punishments came. So Fatima failed, right? Well, let's consider that for a moment. While Mary warned of war and suffering, she also left us with a message of hope, saying, "In the end, my immaculate heart will triumph." But can we really speak of a triumph? I mean, where's the triumph in the face of the horrors of World War II and the persecution of the church by communism? Where's the victory in the midst of so much suffering and death? Well, we find the answer to those questions in the secret of divine mercy. Put differently, the triumph of Mary's immaculate heart is really the triumph of divine mercy. It's the idea that Mary's powerful prayers can bring an even greater good out of the evils that have already come. And the greater good is this: now is the time of mercy. Now is a time of great, extraordinary, and unprecedented grace and mercy for the church and the whole world. Now is a time when God is making it easier than ever before to become saints. Now is the end time when by calling out for mercy, we can prepare the world for the Lord's final coming. And this time of grace wouldn't have been possible without the great evils of the 20th century. Now don't get me wrong. God certainly did not want World War II, nor did He desire the godless totalitarian regime of the Soviet Union. In fact, to prevent these evils, He sent His own mother, Our Lady of Fatima, on one of the most dramatic peacekeeping missions in the history of the world. But not enough people listened and heeded the message, and so God allowed the evils to happen. But now from those very evils, by the power of His mercy, God is drawing not only good, but an even greater good. So it's from this perspective that the haunting vision of the third secret of Fatima begins to make sense. Let's listen again to the most relevant part.
The Holy Father passed through a big city, half in ruins and half trembling with halting step. Afflicted with pain and sorrow, he prayed for the souls of the corpses he met on his way. Having reached the top of the mountain, on his knees, at the foot of the big cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. And in the same way, beneath the two arms of the cross, there were two angels, each with a crystal aspersorium in his hand, in which they gather up the blood of the martyrs and with the sprinkled souls that they were making their way to God.
Do you see then where the graces of the time of mercy come from? They come from the blood of the martyrs. Now recall that the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. There were more martyrs in that century than in all other centuries combined. But again, as the early church father Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Now what did the angels do in the vision? They gathered up the blood of the martyrs. And what did they do with that blood? They sprinkled the souls that were making their way to God. So truly, now is the time of mercy because we're the ones being sprinkled with that blood. And if the blood of the martyrs in the early church brought the grace of conversion to the Roman Empire and to the barbarian hordes that became Christian Europe, then it looks like we're super primed for a new springtime in the church. I mean, now more than at any other time in history, we're awash in the blood of the martyrs. And so in a certain sense, there's more grace and mercy available to us today than ever before in the history of the church. Of course, John Paul II was not one of those martyrs. Rather, he was spared a martyr's death by Our Lady of Fatima so he could lead the Church to the triumph of mercy. Or was he spared? Now, while the Pope didn't die after the May 13th shooting, it seems that he was nevertheless a martyr. I mean, remember how in the third secret it said the following: "The Holy Father passed through a big city, half in ruins, and half trembling with halting step, afflicted with pain and sorrow, he prayed for the souls of the corpses he met on his way. Having reached the top of the mountain, on his knees at the foot of the big cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him." Well, I can't help but think of Pope John Paul II, half trembling with halting step, due to the tremors and poor balance that his Parkinson's brought to him in old age. I can't help but think of him suffering a white martyrdom as he stretched out his arms in his final days on the cross of that disease. Also, I imagine the bullets and arrows of a pain that prevented him on his final Good Friday from leading the Church on the way of the cross in the Colosseum in Rome, a pain that allowed him only to embrace the corpus of Christ on the crucifix in his papal apartments. And on his final Easter Sunday, I remember how he couldn't even speak to the faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square for his Easter message. All he could do was bless them silently. Finally, I think of how John Paul chose to die serenely before the eyes of all the world in his papal apartments in St. Peter's, instead of remaining at the hospital. I think papal biographer George Weigel put it best when he called John Paul's last months and then his death his last and greatest encyclical. An encyclical not of words, but of deeds. An encyclical about suffering with love for the Church. And there's another connection between John Paul's death and Fatima that Pope Benedict XVI noted in his Regina Coeli message on Divine Mercy Sunday in 2008. He said, "In the evening of the unforgettable Saturday, April 2nd, 2005, when Pope John Paul II closed his eyes on the world, it was precisely the eve of the second Sunday of Easter, and many people noted the rare coincidence that combined the Marian dimension, the first Saturday of the month, and the dimension of divine mercy." So John Paul II didn't just die in the arms of divine mercy, he died in the arms of Our Lady as well, and that's fitting. I say that because while Our Lady of Fatima's pleas were not sufficiently heeded and the world experienced more suffering than ever before, God is nevertheless bringing an even greater good out of that great evil through Mary Immaculate. Specifically, she spared the life of John Paul II from an assassin's bullet so he could go on to lead the Church with Mary to the triumph of her Immaculate Heart, the triumph of divine mercy. But before we see precisely how she did that, let me first say something about how the message of Fatima begins and ends with mercy. The three children experienced an earlier visitation. An angel appeared to the young shepherds to prepare them for what was to come. He taught them to pray, and then he encouraged them to pray a lot. The angel then told them, "The most holy hearts of Jesus and Mary have designs of mercy on you." Think of that, designs of mercy. So from the beginning, the mission of Fatima was and is a mission of mercy. But the last vision of Fatima also has to do with mercy. That one didn't happen, though, in October of 1917 with the miracle of the sun. Rather, while Sister Lucia was praying in the chapel at a convent in Tui, Spain, she described that vision as follows.
Suddenly, the whole chapel was illuminated by a supernatural light, and above the altar appeared a cross of light, reaching to the ceiling. In a brighter light, on the upper part of the cross, could be seen the face of a man and his body as far as the waist. Upon his breast was a dove of light. Nailed to the cross was the body of another man. A little below the waist, I could see a chalice and a large host suspending in the air, on which drops of blood were falling from the face of Jesus crucified and from the wound in his side. These drops ran down onto the host and fell into the chalice. Beneath the right arm of the cross was our Holy Lady, and in her hands was her Immaculate Heart. It was Our Lady of Fatima, with her Immaculate Heart in her left hand, without sword or roses, but with a crown of thorns and flames. Under the left arm of the cross, large letters as if of crystal clear water, which rained down upon the altar, formed these words, grace and mercy.
Grace and mercy. Now that's what the time of mercy is all about. Grace and mercy. And that's precisely where the Immaculate Heart wants to lead us. She wants to bring us to the grace and mercy that flow from the wounds of Christ crucified. Now, did you see that in the image? That's what God the Father wants to give us through the blood of His Son and the blood of the martyrs. We're also His sons and daughters. And again, it is Mary who takes us there with her divine spouse, the Holy Spirit. And she does it by means of Marian consecration. Let me explain. It's easy to say that the horrors of World War II and communism happened because the people did not adequately heed the message of Fatima. In other words, they didn't pray enough, didn't amend their lives enough, and didn't do enough penance. But that's only part of the story. Some of the responsibility also falls on the shoulders of the popes and bishops who didn't consecrate Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart in a timely fashion. Now, this isn't a matter of my own opinion. Rather, it comes from the words of Jesus Himself to Sister Lucia. Now, here's the background. It was August of 1931, just weeks after the Nazis became the most powerful political party in Germany, and while Russia suffered through Stalin's 5-year plan to implement communism. And here's what the Lord said to Sister Lucia. The leaders of the Church did not wish to heed my request. Like the King of France, they will repent and do it, but it will be late. Russia will have already spread her errors throughout the world, provoking wars and persecutions of the Church. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Now, the mention of the King of France sort of adds salt to the wounds. Here's why. On June 17, 1689, St. Margaret Mary had written a message from Jesus to the King of France, Louis XIV, requesting that he publicly consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Well, the king ignored the request, as did his son, Louis XV, and grandson, Louis XVI. Now, that grandson and all of the Church of France would have to suffer terribly for this total disregard of the Lord's wishes. So on June 17, 1789, exactly 100 years to the day that Margaret Mary had written her letter to the king, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly of France, taking upon itself legislative power apart from the king. This then began a cascade of events that ultimately led to the beheading of King Louis XVI in 1793, the near destruction of the French Church, and the rise of an anti-Christian secular order that holds sway in France even to this day. Now, could all of that have been avoided if the King of France had heeded the Lord's requests? Well, sadly, after his arrest, King Louis XVI vowed to consecrate himself, his family, and his kingdom to the Sacred Heart of Jesus if he regained his freedom. But by then it was too late. So the king remained in bondage while murderous anti-Christian forces ran free throughout the country. Now, a similar scenario was unfolding with regard to Our Lady of Fatima's 1917 request that the Pope and bishops consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. I mean, even by 1931, her request had still not been heeded. Yet with the election of Pius XII on March 2, 1939, things seemed to change for the better. I say that not only because the new Pope had been consecrated a bishop on May 13, 1917, the date of the first apparition of Fatima, but he also had a deeply Marian spirituality and was very devoted to Our Lady of Fatima. Moreover, the timing of his May 13th Episcopal consecration had not been lost on him. So he seemed like the perfect Pope to fulfill Our Lady's request, even though World War II had already begun. Well, perhaps realizing all this, Sister Lucia wrote to the new Pope in 1940,
If Your Holiness would deign to make the consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, making special mention of Russia, and would order at the same time that in union with Your Holiness all the bishops should also make it. The days should be shortened by which God has decided to punish the nations for their crimes through war, famine, and persecutions against the Church and Your Holiness.
Now notice that the promise here is no longer that war, famine, and persecution will be avoided, but rather shortened. That's because by 1940, World War II's wheels of destruction had already begun to turn. But having the suffering shortened would have been a welcome blessing. Well, thankfully, on October 31st, 1942 in Portugal, Pope Pius XII heeded Our Lady's request and consecrated the world to her Immaculate Heart while making a special reference to Russia. 6 weeks later in Rome, he repeated the consecration on December 8th, the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. Now, unfortunately, only a small number of bishops participated in these two consecrations, so Russia was not converted. Yet the consecrations did seem to affect the course of the war. One sign of that came through Sister Lucia's report that in the spring of 1943, Jesus appeared to her and expressed his great delight over the consecration. The second sign came that same year when the Allies began winning important battles that up until then they'd been losing. In February, for example, the Nazis lost the Battle of Stalingrad, which changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. Eventually, in 1945, World War II ended, but the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West soon began. Now, knowing this, and well aware of the terrible persecution of the Church in communist lands, Pius XII wrote Sacro Vergente Anno, an apostolic letter that explicitly consecrated the people of Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart. Unfortunately, the bishops of the world were not involved, and the letter went unheeded. And no other pope attempted to explicitly consecrate Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart until St. John Paul II. Now that story is the next chapter in the second greatest story ever told.